Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Washington Brief for May 3rd, 2022. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief webcast. He is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan that have met with the legislative, executive, intel, and military leadership of those countries. As president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long experience conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in Northeast Asia and the Middle East. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for all the work you do for the Washington Times Foundation. Today's topic is really taking a look at President Moon and also the incoming president-elect, President Yoon, and the differences we may see there. Our moderator today is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. He's the former special envoy for negotiations with North Korea and the former director of National Counterproliferation Center. Joe is also former associate director of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and special advisor to that DNI. Prior to that, he was senior official in the Central Intelligence Agency. Our panel today consists of Dr. Alexandre Mansourov, who's an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He's also an adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins and at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. He's president and CEO of Great Falls Solutions International consulting firm, and he's also one of the founding members of the National Committee on North Korea. He's one of the few people in the United States that holds advanced degrees at Moscow State University of International Relations, Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang, and North Korea, as well as Columbia University in New York. And our keynote speaker today is Mr. Doug Bandow, who's a senior fellow at the renowned Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as a special assistant to President Reagan and editor of the political magazine Inquiry. Doug writes prolific insight and commentary for foreign policy, Harper's, National Review, the Washington Times, Newsweek, Washington Post, and all major publications, New York Times, and has been featured commentator on Fox News, ABC, CBS, CNN, all the major networks. And we're really honored to present our moderator at this time, who will guide us through the program, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the introduction. And it's great having Doug with us today and Alexandre Mansourov, Dr. Mansourov. There's a lot to discuss today. So let me set the scene, and then we'll go immediately to Doug Bandow. What we're looking at now is on the 10th, that's not too far away, on the 10th of May, we will be seeing the inauguration of a new administration in the Republic of Korea. That's President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol will be taking over. We'll be replacing Moon Jae-in. And President Moon Jae-in leaves a very, very impressive legacy. A legacy that spoke about developments with North Korea, but indeed relations with the United States. What immediately comes to mind is the Panmunjom Declaration, his meetings with Chairman Kim Jong-un of the DPRK, where that spoke about peace and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula, setting up and arranging for the meetings, the summits between President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, the Singapore summit of June of 2018, and then the Hanoi summit in 2019. these were major developments. There were no question major developments on working with North Korea. Inter-Korean relations were a key issue, a key priority of the Sunshine Policy of the Moon Jae-in government. So he leaves a very, very powerful legacy. And he turns it over to someone, the Conservative Party, People Power Party representative, and now the president-elect, to be the president of the Republic of Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol. A conservative who comes in with strong views on the strategic alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea, enhancing that relationship, focusing on things like looking at the Quad, possibly joining the Quad, looking at enhancing the missile defense with the new THAAD systems, but indeed focusing on North Korea and saying complete verifiable denuclearization is what the goal is, peace through strength. So a new administration coming in, and at a very important time, because not only are we seeing the inauguration on the 10th of May of the Yoon Suk-yeol government, we are also going to see a visit on the 21st of May of President Joe Biden to the Republic of Korea, his meetings with President Yoon, and then following that, his meetings in Tokyo. A very, very critical period of time. And the last piece I'll mention is what we've seen from North Korea over the last few weeks and the last few months. Certainly on the 24th of March, we saw the launch of a Hwasong 17. This is an intercontinental ballistic missile that can reach the whole of the United States. They're very significant. Now, on the recent parade on the 25th of April, on the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Korean People's Army, we saw two Hwasong 17s displayed, but also comments from Kim Jong-un indicating that North Korea's nuclear program is not only for deterrence purposes, self-defense deterrence purposes, it could also be used offensively if there's a perception that North Korea and its leadership is being threatened. And over the past weekend, KCNA came out and said, oh, Kim Jong-un has also said possibly even using nuclear weapons preemptively if there is a perception of a threat. So we have all these pieces that come together. So a very important time to turn it over to our guest speaker, Doug Bandow. Over to you, Doug.
Thank you. I thank you, Larry and Dr. Jenkins. It's a great pleasure to be on. I've been watching the Washington Brief this past year, so the opportunity to join Ambassador DeTrani and Dr. Mansourov is an extraordinary pleasure for me. And this is, as Joe mentioned, this is an extraordinarily important time for us. The starting point, I think, is a positive one in that we've had another peaceful transition of power in South Korea. We've had a dramatic political shift from the Progressive Party to a much more conservative party, very narrow election, but we had none of the questions raised in the United States about whether or not the election was fair and who won. I think an extraordinarily smooth process, which was very important at a time like this, and hopefully can help bring South Koreans together after what was frankly a fairly divisive election. Significantly, we've seen a flip, a very important flip in ideology. And what this has done is the first time that we've seen the flip after only one term. If you go back to the first the Democratic election, 1987, what we saw more or less have been two conservative administrations, two progressive administrations, two conservative administrations. Then President Moon was elected, a progressive, and now after only one term, we've gone to the other side. So this will pose some challenge, frankly, for South Korea to adapt to that. A fairly quick change in policy we can expect. That there's the famous, probably fake, but famous Chinese curse about living in interesting times. I think we're going to be doing that in Northeast Asia, and especially Korea's, as we look in the years ahead. Very important are going to be domestic issues that we, I think, on this seminar probably focus on foreign policy because that has the greatest impact on the United States and our policies. But in the ROK, like the United States, people are much more likely to vote on domestic issues. And the recent campaign was driven by some very significant domestic issues, gender issues. I mean, one evidence of that is that that what will soon be the opposition party's chairwoman is 26 years old and is the first woman to, heading a party, young woman heading the party, that, this was an important issue in the recent campaign. Housing prices, economic growth, corruption, all of these were questions swirling around that, helped explain the election's outcome. And they're likely to help drive policy, in the coming months and years. So even as we talk about foreign policy, much of what's going to be happening in Seoul is going to be a domestic argument on domestic policy. And, questions that are going to be very important. I mean, is there going to be an attempt to prosecute, the opposition, former presidents and others? We've had, South Korea has a history of previous presidents ending up in prison. That, investigations, charges of corruption, all of these things are out there. So it could be a very challenging time. On foreign policy, I think there are three major issues we're likely to see, changes of varying degrees. We're going to see, I think, in terms of the US-ROK relationship, South Korea's policy towards North Korea, and also policy towards China, which kind of will have as part of that, I think, that all affected issues of Japan, the Quad, and other things. But these strike me as being three major areas that are going to be very important for us to look at, in the coming months. On the question of the United States, President Yoon, or President-elect Yoon, looks to be very pro the alliance. He wants to strengthen the alliance. Now, this isn't a huge change. One thing we've seen over the years is that progressive presidents have tended to be pro US. Most South Koreans like the alliance. So this is not a dramatic change. Nevertheless, if we've looked at, kind of over time, we've noticed that progressive presidents in the past have sometimes had trouble getting along with Washington. I mean, Kim Dae-jung and President George W. Bush were really not a particularly friendly, duo. Roh Moo-hyun, had his challenges dealing with Washington. And certainly President Moon dealing with the Trump administration, did not find as receptive an audience as did, the Japanese Prime Minister Abe and others. So I think that we're likely to see an improvement where Washington is likely to feel pretty comfortable with the incoming administration. Even if the policy shifts are not huge, they will be important. And generally, I think we're going to see the incoming administration take a tougher policy towards North Korea and China, which is going to be something that the US administration is going to enjoy. And I think we're likely to see closer cooperation on restarting military exercises. We're not likely to see an awful lot of pressure from Seoul to come up with a peace declaration or peace agreement. I don't expect to see a Yoon-Kim summit anytime soon, and things coming out of that. So I think that what we're likely to see here is a much more comfortable working relationship, where Washington's agenda is likely to fit more comfortably with Seoul, and that Seoul's perceptions and views are likely to fit better, with Washington. That the one, I think, potential challenge for this relationship could very well end up being the nuclear issue, where President-elect Yoon and others have pushed for returning tactical nuclear weapons to the peninsula. This is an issue that's grown in concern in the South as the North has moved ahead on its nuclear weapons program. And there's even popular support for a South Korean nuclear weapon. That a feeling that if the North is going to continue building nukes, and it raises questions about extended deterrence, is the US really going to back that up? So this may be a background issue. It's certainly something the Biden administration, I think, would be skeptical of. Progressives in the Democratic administration here in Washington would not likely want to return nuclear weapons to Korea. But this could become an issue that might have at least some, controversy between the two. It'll be interesting to see how this is handled, particularly by President-elect Yoon. I think that, his decision on that, whether he's going to bring this up, is going to be critical for the alliance. The second question is North Korea. I mean, this is, from South Korea's standpoint, the central issue for its existence. That, it's an existential issue, obviously, having had a horrendous war, more than 70 years ago, that no one wants a repeat, and especially to see North Korea developing nuclear weapons, is a matter of concern for anyone in the South. And to some degree, it strikes me that there's nowhere for the relationship to go but down. And that's not, strictly true. I mean, there have been moments where it's improved. I mean, there were summits under, three different progressive, presidents met with the North Korean leader. Nevertheless, out of all those episodes, we've never seen a permanent improvement in relations. We've never seen permanent stabilization, permanent peace, denuclearization. And given the at least initial high point for President Moon of meeting with Kim at the time that President Trump was engaging in summits, it's hard to see how the relationship with the new president can not get worse. That if one looks at the attitudes of Yoon, he has. You look back after the Hanoi summit, President Kim or Leader Kim, Supreme Leader Kim, Chairman Kim, however you want to refer to him, basically treated the South Koreans with extraordinary dismissiveness and even contempt. I mean, it was highlighted, I think, by the destruction of the liaison building that had been built by the ROK. So that was the treatment of a president in the South who had actually been pushing for a better relationship with the North, very hard. And President Yoon will take office as someone who's been much more critical of the North, and is likely to push policies that are in terms of, again, reinstating military exercises, etc. We're not likely to see a Yoon-oriented sunshine policy. That one would expect that Kim is going to respond to this very badly. And one can think back, and hopefully we don't get there, but under Lee Myung-bak and also Park Geun-hye, episodes in those administrations, the sinking of the Cheonan ship, the bombardment, artillery bombardment, almost triggering potential war, the closure of Kaesong. So we've seen previously the North Korean response to more conservative South Korean governments has been a hostile one. And it's certainly possible we'll see that in the coming months. We don't know, and we certainly hope it doesn't happen, but I don't think we should be surprised if it does. And the question then is to my mind, the real issue that I find very worrisome is Kim prepared to negotiate at all? And what chance is there of trying to make progress on the nuclear issue? I think the general view in Washington is that Kim is unlikely to give up his nuclear weapons. Everything that he has said, especially the recent statements, some of which Joe mentioned, do not suggest an interest in giving up something which he's viewing as a deterrent, especially one that he thinks could have a positive and a preemptive use. That I think is raises very real concerns. And if we watch him recently, he's come up with a very long list of weapons he wants to develop, and he's indicated that he's no longer feels bound by his suspension of ICBM and nuclear tests. He's already shown he's not that the ICBM ban is over, and there's a lot of speculation about a potential nuclear test. The question is he at the moment just waiting like he's done in the past to try to make contact with the U.S. and South Korea? The problem there is that everyone has wanted to talk to him and he's refused. So in contrast to the past, he hasn't had to try to scare Washington or Seoul into talking to him. They've wanted to talk to him. What he's done is completely dismiss the possibility. What I wonder is he decided after Hanoi that any discussion today means he has to give up his nuclear weapons for sanctions relief. So he's just going to build a lot more weapons until he can negotiate from a position of unassailable strength. A report from the Asan Institute and the Rand Corporation, suggested that the North could have as many as 200 nuclear weapons by 2027. Imagine something approaching that, from North Korea. Then, and then they step forth and decide they want to negotiate. So I think we have to worry very much about where the North is going and how to approach it. That we may find ourselves facing a North Korea not willing to talk, not willing to engage, but instead moving ahead at a time where, frankly, China is going to be much more willing to support it, or at the very least not come against it. And the final big issue to my mind is China. That China has shown, as we've seen the disastrous, self-defeating actions of Russia, China, to a lesser degree with wolf warrior diplomacy and such, has hurt itself. Made a lot of enemies and not many friends. And they certainly did that in South Korea, where they managed to go from one of the most favored countries to one of the most disliked countries with all of the sanctions and pressure after the THAAD deployment. Now, the Moon administration has tried to deal very carefully with China, hesitant to criticize it on human rights and other things. It looks like the incoming president does not feel such compunctions, that he is much more likely to challenge China. He's interested, he's talked about deploying another battery, THAAD battery, which we can imagine how that would go over in Beijing. That, certainly not the hypersensitive attitude that we've seen, recently. Add to that the fact that he's interested in improving relations with Japan. Very complicated issue there, but that's certainly good news. He sent a delegation to Tokyo just a week or so ago to meet with the Japanese prime minister, clearly trying to set up, the process to improve relations between the two. The U.S. has wanted this. It's certainly, and really necessary to have America's democratic allies working together. And this is something that Yoon appears to be very committed to, not likely to go over well in Beijing, as well as a much greater interest in the Quad. In fact, it's either earlier today or yesterday, depending on South Korean time, that Yoon met with the Australian ambassador and indicated in Seoul and indicated his interest in having Australian support for having South Korea be able to cooperate with working groups as part of the Quad. Now, again, China sees the Quad as an anti-China grouping, and frankly, not without some justification. I mean, it's not a formal alliance. Nevertheless, India, Australia, Japan, the US, what brings everyone together at the moment with some immediacy is the challenge of China. And certainly having South Korea work with that group would give it greater strength and would likely give China some more pause. So you put all of that together, I think we could very well see a Chinese relationship with South Korea that deteriorates. The real question is, what will Beijing do? It may very well find itself under enough pressure given its relationship with Russia today, and basically refusing to take a more proactive and positive kind of steps to try to help end this terrible conflict against Ukraine, that it might decide that it can't really afford to try to punish South Korea again. Nevertheless, I think this is going to be an interesting challenge to watch, that over the long term, what it may do is cause China to decide it's going to stand foursquare for North Korea. So even if North Korea decides to test a nuclear weapon, China might decide that this time they're not going to worry so much. Up through 2017, we had at least intermittent Chinese cooperation in terms of placing tougher sanctions on and enforcing sanctions. That ebbed after 2018. I think they were very nervous about losing ground with the United States. At the moment, it's hard for me to imagine we'll get any cooperation out of Beijing when it comes to North Korea. And I think we may very well see their relationship get somewhat better to the detriment of U.S. and ROK goals on the peninsula. So there's much, much may change with the new president. I think that all predictions are dangerous. Among other things, President-elect Yoon was not a politician of the normal sort before he was elected, so he might change his mind on things. He might, find new ideas. Nevertheless, his administration is looking a lot different than what we've had over the last 5 years. I think much of that will go over well with Washington, but I think there are going to be some very important challenges there. And I look forward to our discussion about these issues. So thank you, Ambassador DeTrani.
Thank you, Doug. That was outstanding. What outstanding comments, talking about the domestic imperatives that are going on in the Republic of Korea, but also highlighting the relations with North Korea and the potential for a bit more tension with North Korea, if you will. Talking about tactical nuclear weapons possibly being deployed in the Republic of Korea, and maybe even South Korea going possibly nuclear and moving towards, regardless of the U.S. extended nuclear deterrence commitments, but also chatting about mentioning China in a significant way, and relations between the Republic of Korea and China, and with the Yoon, President-elect Yoon, looking at possibly South Korea joining the Quad. A lot there to unpack. And certainly we're fortunate to have Dr. Mansourov to talk about all these very, very important issues. So, Alexander, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Doug. This was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it was very educational, illuminating. So it's my pleasure to offer some comments about your talk. But let me begin by kind of pontificating a little bit about the legacy of the outgoing liberal President Moon. In a way, let me highlight some of the major accomplishments and setbacks of the Moon administration, because this is probably the last time we're going to discuss in depth the legacy of the liberal Moon rule in Korea. So on the positive side, definitely, I mean, the bottom line is we had peace in Korea for the past 5 years, and that's important. Other regions in the world, they erupted in violence, and yet the Korean Peninsula, despite all the tensions, remained in peace. And I would give credit, a lot of credit for that to President Moon. Again, on the positive side, as Ambassador DeTrani mentioned, it was President Moon who orchestrated several summits with his North Korean counterpart, which culminated in the signing of historic Panmunjom Declaration. Also, as a result of those summits, two Koreas signed the Comprehensive Military Agreement, which reduced significantly tensions along the DMZ. And a question in my mind, Doug, I hope you will address it at some point, whether the Yoon administration will keep the Comprehensive Military Agreement, or as some speculated, maybe this will be one of those elements from the Moon legacy that they will junk. Again, in the past 5 years, we did not have any significant military provocations along the DMZ, which is important because, as you know, in the 10 years, 20 years from now, this was a significant risk factor in the naval areas, but even on land. Also, it was President Moon's bold initiatives that led to his persistent efforts to mediate between North Korea and the United States, which facilitated the historic Trump-Kim Jong-un summits in Singapore and in Hanoi, and even on the demilitarized zone. And finally, on the positive side, I would mention the cessation of the psychological warfare broadcasts along the DMZ, which again contributed to the improvement, at least of the atmospherics between the two Koreas. That said, we cannot ignore some of the setbacks, some of the negative elements of the past 5 years. First of all, there was very little cooperation, little progress in the North-South reconciliation and cooperation as such. And again, a lot of it was beyond President Moon's control because increasingly North Korea came under international sanctions, which hampered any good positive initiatives from Seoul. Again, sanctions are still in place. If anything, many more layers of international sanctions were added. Although I can no longer say that North Korea is a champion in this regard, because it was far outpaced by Russia. The speed with which Russia came under international approbation sanctions is beyond belief. So now Russians actually will have to learn quite a bit from North Koreans how to survive in the brave new world of being an international rogue state and pariah. Now, on the negative side, again, Kaesong, as you mentioned, Kaesong Industrial Complex is still closed, and this was the star, model of inter-Korean cooperation. Moreover, the way North Koreans blow up the liaison office, it was a public humiliation by the Moon administration. I mean, it wasn't the Moon administration that began to disengage from Kaesong. I blame, put the blame for that on the previous South Korean government. But nevertheless, no matter how hard they tried, they could not reopen Kaesong, nor could they reopen the Mount Kumgang tourism project. It's still closed. Bilateral trade between the North and South is still almost non-existent, nil. And it's not only because of sanctions. We know we lived through the pandemic, so the North Korean borders were closed, not only with South Korea, but with China, with Russia as well. The communication lines are not functioning the way they used to in the past. But the most worrisome aspect of the past 5 years to me is the fact that the Kim government, the Kim regime continues to build up its weapons of mass destruction. Just this year, they've had, 12 dozen missile tests, including an ICBM test. So they terminated the unilateral moratorium on the ICBM launches. So they resumed the tests of intermediate range ballistic missiles, tactical ballistic, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, you name it. And now they're talking about possibly resuming the nuclear weapons tests, whether one or two, even before the end of this year. And this is another question which I'd like you to address, and that is, in the past, the North Korean regimes, they tended to probe the intentions of the incoming governments in Seoul by staging all sorts of, I call them strategic demonstrations, whether that's ICBM tests or nuclear weapons tests. So what do you think? I mean, what is your expectation? Are they going to follow the same pattern and probe the Yoon administration's intentions with some strategic demonstrations, how tough they are, whether when they say jump, people in Seoul will jump or sit quiet? And what do you expect the reaction from the incoming administration to be? Now, continuing to look at the kind of negative letter, if you wish, of the Moon legacy, we didn't see any real cooperation, even in the most urgent areas like the health sector, for example. I mean, during the pandemic, that's what you would expect, and yet nothing happened, no vaccine swaps, no kind of humanitarian assistance, significant assistance in the medical field. Moreover, because of the developments beyond his control, President Moon's control, he really lost the support of both China and Russia, in my opinion, in the UN Security Council for any further kind of punishing actions should North Korea resume nuclear tests or missile tests. Again, it's the fault is not Moon's. It's just, the situation kind of developed beyond his control. But the bottom line is that the united front, which was aimed at constraining North Korean nuclear and missile programs, collapsed. And now we enter a different world, if you wish, where the Cold War era alliances have resurfaced. I mean, they're being cemented as we speak. And your presentation kind of highlighted the situation on the Chinese side. I can testify that the same is happening on the Russian side as well. So basically, on balance, in my opinion, although the Moon administration's North Korea policy succeeded in keeping peace on the peninsula and keeping the situation under control, realistically, his soft line approach to North Korea failed to deliver the expected results in terms of denuclearization, improvement of human rights, inter-Korean reconciliation. So the North-South relations, I don't see them having improved significantly under the liberal rule. I mean, just in one sentence, we are no closer to reunification today than we were 5 years ago, if anything. Now, very briefly, you talked a lot about your expectations with respect to President-elect Yoon and his policy towards the alliance. Yes, I agree, it will be pro-alliance, a very strong defender of and advocate of U.S. initiatives, whether it's Quad, whether it's improving ties with Japan and trilateral cooperation there. Now, my third question would be if you could think about it. Many say Yoon will pursue the ABM policy, anything but moon policy, with respect to some issues like North Korea, China, what have you. You seem to have taken a more refined, kind of more calibrated approach, saying, no, some elements of the moon legacy will be put aside, but some will be inherited. And specifically, that kind of strong relationship which President Moon had after, President Trump left the scene and the Biden administration came to the White House. So I guess I'll stop here for now so that we can have some conversation. And basically, I'll hand it over back to you, Joe.
Okay, Alexandra, you put a lot on the table, very outstanding comments as always, some good questions. And Doug, if you'd be kind enough to respond to some of those questions, and then let's open it up for a little discussion. Doug.
Absolutely. No, that's Alexandra, those are very good questions you've raised. I think in many ways, the fundamental lesson of the Moon administration is that whoever is president of South Korea, whatever their ideology, they are in many ways limited in their ability to affect the relationship with North Korea. Certainly Moon was frustrated, because of sanctions and US policy. There wasn't much he could really offer North Korea. And I suspect that may be one of the reasons Kim responded the way that he did, which was, it turns out, you guys are just flunkies of Washington. You can't do anything without their permission, so why should I pay attention to you? That was the sense. The rhetoric, of Kim's sister and the blowing up the. There's so much that really was humiliating. It was not just rejection; it went beyond that. And if you look at, certainly Moon, failed to achieve his objectives, but Park and Lee also didn't achieve their objectives. So 10 years of conservative, tougher, stronger administrations. And what was the end result? Well, the peninsula was no closer to denuclearization or reunification either. And I think that so the question is, can Yoon, break forth from that? And I think that's going to be a very real challenge for him. And I agree that I don't believe it's likely to be anything but Moon. My sense that Yoon is different in the sense that he's not a long time, kind of conservative politician. That he kind of broke the mold of, kind of going back and forth between the guys who've been running, so often these are people who, like Moon ran before and he lost. Well, he runs again and he wins. So Yoon was not one who I think was ideologically predisposed against Moon, but rather, came to his positions for whatever reason, not so much because I think Moon held them or the progressives held them, but it's what he believed. So I could see him not feeling quite the same need to reject anything that Moon came up with.
And yet, one of his first decisions was to relocate, the seat of the South Korean government from the Blue House to the Ministry of Defense, which is, to some people symbolizes that emergence of at least laying the ground for the emergence of the wartime presidency, if you wish. I know he did it for other reasons, domestic political reasons. It was a populist promise he made during the election campaign. But, 10,000 miles away, it looks like, okay, the guy's setting up headquarters at the Ministry of Defense. Is he preparing to fight a war there in Korea?
Well, I agree that he may have misperceived how this would look in Pyongyang. And I think that is a real danger. That, I think it was Henry Kissinger who once said that even paranoids have enemies. That if you're sitting in Pyongyang, believing they want to decapitate your regime, believing that you have lots of enemies, that you could look at a step like this and say, oh, you're going to be, sitting right there to push the button. But I don't think that was Yoon's intent. And I think in many ways, Yoon was playing against not just Moon, but all the previous presidents, kind of in some sense, the imperial South Korean presidency. He was trying to move away from that. But I agree with you. I worry a little bit about how, that will be affected. You ask about, the question of, for example, the military agreement. And that I think is an interesting question. It wouldn't surprise me that the North might decide to get rid of that. That from Yoon's perspective, I think that, I don't have a good sense of how patient is he. But this is one of those things where he doesn't have to act instantly. What is the North going to do? And I think this is where we're not sure of what's motivating Kim. That a good test is, does Kim start tearing things up? That Moon had decided that he can't blow up the liaison building again, but okay, what else could he do? Or does Kim decide, I want to keep everything fairly calm? That I'm not trying to blow things up. And if so, does Yoon want to blow that up? It strikes me that, Yoon is already taking some steps that are very important that from a North Korean standpoint are provocative, restarting the military exercises. Now, we all understand, the North's complaints about this really are not particularly serious from our standpoint, but, the North uses that and will undoubtedly use that again. So, does Yoon want to go all the way and pile things up, or is he going to, take 2 or 3 of these steps and then see how things go? We're going to have to wait and see. I don't have a good sense for him, but to me, strategically, it would make sense for him, to wait. And I think the whole.
So Doug, can I interrupt 1 second, Doug?
Sure, absolutely.
If you could just wrap that up, because I want to follow up on a few other points that you and Alexandra made. But if you could wrap up the questions with Alexandra, and I'll move to some other issues. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Let me just very briefly, Alexandra raised the question of strategic demonstration. That might we see that from the North? And to my mind, this I think will be a good test of Kim's intentions. Does he want to try to engage them and use provocation to engage, or is he have a longer range plan where he'd much prefer to keep things calm and build up and do tests and stuff, as opposed to create, kind of hassles on the peninsula? And I think we're going to have to wait and see. And frankly, this is a case I'd prefer to see provocation, because I'm afraid if he doesn't do provocation, that he may have a longer range agenda that frankly is more dangerous. But I'll turn it back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Doug. The outstanding comments. Let me posit this, because both you gentlemen mentioned it, and I mentioned it in my opening, the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue with North Korea. I've been going back to January 2021, and Alexandra, you mentioned that Kim Jong-un was very, very outspoken in telling the world, not only the North Koreans, the world, he'd be working on hypersonics, he'll be working on submarine launched ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. He will MIRV the intercontinental ballistic missiles, looking at solid fuel, mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles. And on the 24th of March, we saw the Hwasong 17 launch, a successful launch, can touch the whole of the United States, and then the showing them at the parade. So on the missile delivery system, significant accomplishments on the part of North Korea, to include not only the cruise missile, but short-range ballistic missiles, solid fuel that could potentially deliver a nuclear warhead. A lot on delivery systems. Also on building his nuclear arsenal. Doug, you mentioned some of the assessments out there. Currently the assessments between 40 and 60. You said by 2027, some are saying up to 200 nuclear warheads. That is all very, very significant. And the pronouncements that have been coming out of Pyongyang in the person of Kim Jong-un, talking about not only having nuclear weapons And this is something he's been saying for 30 years, and his father before him and his grandfather. Nuclear weapons are for deterrence purposes, not to be used against anyone. And now talking about a perceived threat to the regime, to the government, to the leadership, to the country, he could use nuclear weapons. And now even using the term preemptive, the preemptive use of nuclear weapons. So gentlemen, my sense here is on the nuclear side, this is getting very tense, very tense. And I don't want to go to the Ukraine war, but certainly President Putin put nuclear weapons on the table immediately in the Ukraine by saying they're on high alert. So we're seeing these pronouncements out of North Korea while he's working on these systems and showing he's able to deliver on these systems. And Doug, my last comment on your comment, where South Korea is saying maybe we need tactical nuclear weapons here. Others in South Korea saying maybe we need our own nuclear deterrence capabilities here. So gentlemen, and I'll go to you first, Doug, and then Alexandra. On the nuclear issue here, things are getting very tense. How do you see them evolving? And how do we sort of diffuse? How do we move it in a different direction so it doesn't lend itself to stumbling into the possibility of accidental warfare?
I agree with you, Joe, that that we're seeing out of Kim a much more, I think, dangerous rhetoric in terms of the potential use of nuclear weapons. And it strikes me this is a good reason why we have to try to engage. This is not something we can kick down the road, because kicking it down the road could very well leave us in a much worse position. To my mind, the danger is putting together three different things. One is quantity. That is, if you move from 40 or 60, whatever the number is today, to 100, 150, 200, you're up as an intermediate nuclear power. You're up in the range of France. You're up in the range of the United Kingdom, Israel, Pakistan, India, these countries. A second is having ICBMs that can hit the United States, and not just hit but target, which is an important difference. And then having MIRV warheads, which allow you to try to overcome any kind of defense system. That to the extent North Korea could threaten American cities, it does raise substantial issues in terms of extended deterrence. Extended deterrence is easy if the person you're trying to deter does not have nuclear weapons capable of hitting you. If North Korea could do so, would the United States be prepared to live with that? And that, I think, is raising the concerns in South Korea, where South Koreans are asking that question. I'm very, very worried about where we're heading on this. And I think that's why we do need to engage, because if we enter that world, I don't see a good outcome, and I don't see a good exit. And I haven't seen a lot of people talking about it, and that worries me an awful lot. And I think I'm interested in Alexandra's.
Thank you so much, Doug. Alexandra, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And I second everything Doug said, and I do share Ambassador DeTrani's concern. Now, with respect to preemption, although the North Korean leader recently used the word preemption, if we look back at the North Korean nuclear doctrine and how it evolved over many years, this is not something new. I mean, tit for tat has always been the game. They always talked about preemption for preemption. Maybe, in the past, we found references to preemption in some general staff pronouncements, in the KCNA spokesman's interviews, foreign ministry statements. And this time, it's the first time when the North Korean leader himself used the word preemption, which kind of elevated the level of authoritativeness, if you wish, in this commitment. But the idea of preempting our preemptive strike is not something new. I mean, we really kind of had to deal with it for many years. That's number one. Number two, what really worries me is not change in tone here or change in rhetoric, but it's the explosive growth in the North Korean capabilities, strategic capabilities. And this is happening at the time of, multi-layered international sanctions, which is supposed to be enforced by everybody, which is happening at the time of the pandemic when North Korean borders are supposed to be closed, tight, and all that. And so my question is, why? What's going on? As Ambassador said, what's driving this explosive growth? Have they found some magic bullet, if you wish, which is putting them on steroids? Or maybe, there is a leakage, a growing leakage in the international sanctions regimes, which enables North Korea to execute more and more successfully the WMD pursuits. Now, the reason why I'm worried is because, and you cannot escape it. I mean, this is the new world in which we live. The war in Ukraine is basically taking over a lot of geopolitical agendas. The United States and its allies decided to supply advanced offensive weapons to the enemy of great power armed with nuclear weapons, then we should expect that Russia may one day, and this day will come very soon, much sooner than we expect, will start supplying similar advanced offensive weapons to the enemies of the United States where it hurts. And if you believe that North Korea or the Korean Peninsula will escape that fate, I'm afraid you're mistaken. Because, again, South Korea just pretty much cut off all its ties with the Russian Federation, economically froze trade, froze Russian foreign exchange, joined the US-led sanctions effort against Russia, sent some of its volunteers, quote unquote, to the Ukrainian front, although the government tries to look the other way or wash their hands off that. Now, South Korea, again, is becoming an enemy of Russia in that global fight. Believe it or not, it's hard to admit this after 30 years of normalized relations. And yet, that's the reality. So to expect that Russia will ignore it, will look the other way, especially when Kim is more than willing to take anything, Moscow may offer to enhance his capabilities. So I'd say this is going to be real. When we are pumping up $35 billion of offensive weaponry into Ukraine, and only $6 billion for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative all across Asia Pacific, that's a mismatch because in waging asymmetric warfare against the global hegemon, I think Russia and its allies or partners, including China, including some other nations, they will step up their countermeasures, military countermeasures.
So let me
spots again.
Okay, let me then pivot from that, Alexander. Thank you for your comments. Look, when we looked at the Trump administration, 2017, fire and fury. This is when things were getting very, very tense. And then we saw the summits, the Singapore summit. Before that, obviously, Panmunjom Declaration, the summit between President Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. But then during the summits, the Singapore, and then the Hanoi, and you mentioned the visit to the DMZ, there was a moratorium, self-imposed, but there was a moratorium from North Korea, no nuclear tests, no intercontinental ballistic missile launches, although they were still launching short-range ballistic missiles, existential threats to South Korea and to Japan. But nothing that approaches what we're seeing over the last year and a half plus. So this is all very, very significant. So the key then would be when we were negotiating, when we were talking to North Korea, they sort of stopped. There was a bit of a moratorium, not a complete moratorium, but a bit of a moratorium. So one would think the imperative has to be get them back to the table, sit down and stop launching ballistic missiles. Do not have your 7th nuclear test at Punggye-ri. You're making it very clear this is what your intentions are and so forth. Doug, you mentioned China. Alexander, you also mentioned China. Liu Xiaoming, their special representative to the Korean Peninsula, was in Seoul just the last few days, talking about North Korea and the United States resolving the nuclear issue with North Korea, and South Korea and China sort of being cooperating and trying to be helpful in that area. China can do quite a bit, one would think, because of the leverage China has with North Korea. Trade, over 90% of the trade, over 90% of the crude and petroleum products come from China. Should China be doing more? Where is China on this? Because, gentlemen, let me just posit this. North Korea with nuclear weapons and what they're doing now with talking about a perceived threat they could use, talking about possibly even preemptive use of nuclear weapons, that has to be of concern not only to our allies in the Republic of Korea and into Japan, but also to China and to Russia in the region. So what more can China specifically be doing, and even maybe Russia in that regard, given their relationship with North Korea, to get the Koreans to come back to negotiations and stop this escalation of nuclear and missile technology so that we don't stumble into conflict? Over to you first, Alexandra, and then to you, Doug.
Thank you, Ambassador. We don't have much time, so I'll be very brief. I'll just say that the era of denuclearization talks is over. I mean, we are witnessing an escalation of arms race, military buildups across the world, which will impact Northeast Asia as well, these competitive military buildups. And so to expect countries like Russia or China to go back to the previous times, the globalization days, the glory days of globalization, I think it's a little bit naive. I mean, we have entered a new brave world. It's a nasty world. Nobody is going to disarm or even talk about denuclearization anymore in this region. And until the Russia-Ukraine situation is settled, and again, there are different ways how it can settle. Hopefully, we will still be alive when it is.
Thank you, Alexander. Over to you, Doug.
I think the long-term challenge has always been that while China does not want a nuclear North Korea, it is not interested in using the mechanisms that will affect its other red line, which is not to have a North Korean collapse. No one wants millions of refugees across the Yalu, loose nuclear weapons, civil war in North Korea, etc. Imagine China lecturing the U.S. to put pressure on a nuclear Mexico, that might blow up Mexico. The U.S. would be quite, wouldn't be very happy with that advice. So I think that's always tempered China's willingness to do much. And especially today, I think that China is just not very interested in helping the U.S. That at the moment, China is much more likely to look at North Korea as a potential benefit of causing trouble for the U.S., especially if it perceives an increasingly close relationship between South Korea and Japan in the U.S., and perceives them working together in the Quad, which it views as a containment mechanism of China. That unfortunately, I think as Alexander indicated, Russia has a different reason for potentially weaponizing North Korea. I think China shares that for somewhat different reasons, we're at a point where we should not expect any help from either of these governments. It's unfortunate, and I think we can argue it's in their long-term disinterest, not in their interest. But frankly, they don't care how we perceive their interest. I think they are perceiving it very differently, which makes this, again, a much more dangerous time. There's not a lot, frankly, we can appeal to Xi Jinping on to get him on board with this.
So thank you, Doug, and thank you, Alexander, for those very insightful comments. As you gentlemen have mentioned often, and I totally agree with that, we're living in a very tense period here. And the nuclear issue with North Korea is existential to all of us, to our allies in the region, and certainly to the United States. This is something that has to be resolved. And getting North Korea back to negotiations to talk about moving in a different direction, Alexandra said that is naive, but that should be our goal, continued goal, because the complete verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula has to be the goal there. Now, if it's seemingly not attainable at this moment, there's no question about that. Why would North Korea give up its nuclear weapons? They saw what happened with Ukraine giving up over 1,900 nuclear warheads in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum for security assurances, and that went down the tubes. And so why would that? What a stark message that is to North Korea. So the job with North Korea is that much more difficult, but keeping some hope there and working towards inter-Korean relations so that we can get some momentum there. And that's where over to our diplomats, over to our respective countries, and let's end on this note also. Not being able to accomplish that, we're talking about a nuclear arms race potentially in the region. We're talking about the potential also of nuclear weapons, whether it's a nuclear weapon or fissile material for a dirty bomb getting into the hands of a terrorist organization. This is something we have to prevent. We have to move left to prevent these actions, the potential of these developments happening, so that we don't look at mitigation strategies, but preventive strategies. And that's why with the President-elect Yoon coming in at this time, a very critical time, but a very important time for him to be sitting down with our President, Joe Biden, on the 21st of May to talk about all these major issues. And so I want to thank you, gentlemen, for a great discussion today. Dr. Jenkins, I want to thank you and the Washington Brief and the Washington Foundation for permitting us to have these very candid discussions so that we can illuminate all these issues, so that all Americans and our colleagues all over the world can be part of this discussion. Over to you, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Ambassador DeTrani. And again, another very important program. Thank you to Mr. Doug Bandow of the Cato Institute, giving us such clear insight, and to Dr. Mansourov for always your very present knowledge of the current situation. We do believe there is hope. The Washington Times is one of our sponsors. We want to express our gratitude for that sponsorship, the Universal Peace Federation also, and especially Congressman John Doolittle, who is here with us on the program as our special advisor and helping to communicate this knowledge to members of Congress so that they can be better educated on the options for the future. We do believe there's hope as long as we continue to pursue negotiations, understanding, and communication. If we stop communicating, it's really dangerous. So we hope that we can contribute to that communication, not only here, but in our Washington Times fact finders to Korea and Japan, and possibly in the future to China and North Korea. We are pursuing all those different areas. I want to thank Mr. Larry Moffat, our executive director of the Washington Times Foundation, and to all of our listening audience. This is a great program. Next month on June 7th, the first Tuesday, United States Senator Todd Young will be our guest presenter and keynote speaker. He's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the United States Senate, and that will also give us some inside views from the Foreign Affairs Committee. We look forward to seeing you next month on every first Tuesday. We have the Washington Brief. Also at this same time, every Tuesday, we have a various programs on Korea. Next week is a program of the role of the faith leaders throughout the different continents. The week after that is the role of culture and arts, and a very special guest will be Dr. Terwillinger from Columbia University, who has played a key role with the UREC Symphony from North Korea coming to America, to Carnegie Hall, and his symphony from Columbia University and other colleagues collaborating with them to bring at least communication and friendship through music and art. So we are looking at every possible way. We thank you all for this program. Thank you again, Ambassador DeTrani. It's a great joy to be with you. We do want to mention Ambassador Hill has been with us for over a year, and he is now in his place as Serbia, as the U.S. ambassador to Serbia. We want to thank Chris. He did an excellent job with this program, and we built up a very nice following in the intel community, State Department, U.S. Congress, and the White House. We want to pursue that even further. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.